Okay, we just completed Shavuos, Matan Torah, so we're all energized by our learning over Shavuos, and we're excited to carry forward. We're starting a new Mishnah today, a continuation of the general thought, but a new Mishnah on Chaf Amud Aleph. Chaf Amud Aleph. So we'll pick up right there. Says the Mishnah. Now, we're talking about documents and different things that have gotten lost. Gittin and Shtar Shifra in the last Mishnah on Yud Ches. We were talking about Daitike, a deathbed will, gifts, receipts, all these things. The Mishnah there told us Lo Yachzor, and the Mishnah then, the Gemara then expounded why you can't return and on what conditions you can return. So that Gemara gave us a pretty good, clear picture of the roadmap of Metzias. Having learned that, this Mishnah will embellish and in some ways counter what we just learned. So in other words, we've learned some pretty clear halachas, or I say halachas, I mean the pattern of which halacha talks about, but the pattern of what you do when you find a document. We're going to see from this Mishnah that's going to override some of those things we just learned. So we'll get ready for that in a minute. All right, so let's start. The Mishnah says, Motza Igros. If someone finds a letter, we've talked about documents, shtorim, documents where properties are assigned when you make a loan, right? So you signed a shtar and a shtar shibud, and that shtar shibud is what allows someone, a creditor, to collect from a debtor's property if the debtor sold that property after he made the loan. So in order not to get her out of paying the creditor has certain rights to that property. Shtar shibud, we call them. Okay. Now, here, Motza Igrushum, this is letters. This is not shtaros. What's the difference between a letter and a shtar? Well, the difference, according to what the Gemara tells us and what we know generally, and Rashi says is at the very, very beginning, an igros is a letter written by the Beis Din that says that this person is entitled to this property by assignment. So it's a letter that a Beis Din issues, like a halachic letter, which they can issue to an individual, to another Beis Din in another place. But these are the letters that enact what the shtar would do. So if we have a shtar shibud and the creditor is allowed to collect under the shtar shibud, then the igros shum, this letter will sort of codify that Beis Din is saying he may do that. That assignment that he has, that shibud that he has, is a valid shibud. So Rashi says right away, Igros shum, sheshomu Beis Din nichse lo v'lamalve b'chovo. So this is Beis Din that's putting its imprimatur in the form of a letter that the possessions of the lover belong to the malveh because of the chov. So that's what's pshat igros shum, that it supports what a person has already done with that shibud. Okay, igros shum, one category. Igros mazon. What is an igros mazon? It's an interesting concept. We know that when a man marries and he has he issues his wife a ksuba, so the ksuba refers to his responsibilities to the wife and inherently to the offsprings of that marriage. So if the wife has a child or the family has multiple children, then he has obligations, the husband has obligations to the entire family. What happens if a woman comes into the marriage with a child? Okay, she's been previously married, she has a child, now she marries a man. What obligations does that man have to that child? So technically, al pi halacha, he may have no obligations to her because the ksuba that he's giving is the ksuba, which is a slightly differently worded ksuba in terms of the amount of money and other things given to the wife. But what about his obligations to the daughter, to the what would be his new daughter, stepdaughter? So says the Mishnah, Igros Mazon. He wrote a letter. There is a documented letter saying that I, Ruvain, the stepfather, am giving sustenance to the daughter Rivka of my wife.
Is there any
Okay?
significance that we're talking about a bas? I saw Rashi says bas ishto. Is there any?
No, because typically, remember in the hierarchy of what we talk about the women being more vulnerable because the men went to work and the women before equality and all the other things didn't go to
I
work.
assume that, but this would apply to
Any child.
offspring.
Yes, yeah.
And you don't even need an igeres because it's implicit if it's from that if it's his child. If he marries a woman and they have children, it's implicit.
Exactly. So
okay.
So Igros Muslim, Rashi said Shekibel of Lozam as Bas Ishto. Right. So he was Makabel to sustain the daughter of his new wife, and he writes her a shtar. Now again, keep in mind these letters are for illustrious or identifying purposes. That's not what makes the requirement.
Right.
The requirement is that he has to remember. In any case, he has to have a kinyan. Kinyan is in Jewish law what codifies or solidifies an event between two people, right? Whether they sell a transaction, mechiras chometz, you name it, you have to have a kinyan. And that kinyan is a symbolic transfer of ownership or of making the connection. This letter identifies that this is what this man has pledged to do. Now, if he didn't make a kinyan, that letter has no teeth to it. You can't go, the young girl can't go and say, you promised me, right? Which l'chaira, if it's in a document in our modern society, under our laws, a document, the four corners of a document identifies what the conditions are. In halacha, that's not the case. It's the kinyan. Let's say there was never a letter of mazon. There was never this igros mazon, and there was only a kinyan. Is it valid? Sure, because usually you make a kinyan before Adim. So you would have Adim who would say, yes, he made a kinyan. Okay, but how does the world know? Okay, there's no letter. She doesn't have that letter, but she has a kinyan and she has Adim. So that's how, in fact, it works in Jewish law. But nevertheless, so what happens if these documents get lost? The point of this Mishnah is if he wrote a document and the document gets lost, the question will be to whom do we return it? To the writer or the recipient? Okay, so that's the second category. Shtori chalitza. What about a shtar chalitza? Everybody knows that in terms of a elaborate marriage that's required in halacha in the time of the Torah, that there was a you had to give you had to marry, and if you didn't marry, then you had to do a chalitza. The chalitza is an act where you give a shoe, and then there's a ceremonial back and forth. The wife spits, and okay, those are the principles of chalitza. And now, so what happens if he wrote a shtar chalitza? Okay, so he wrote the shtar, and the shtar basically says that Ruvain is giving chalitza to Rivka, and okay, so that's the identifier. And what happens if it gets lost? Who do you give it to kind of have the proof, if you will, of the chalitza? Umiunin. Now, this is a very interesting category. Now, we're going to look at Rashi, and I'm going to talk about it for a minute. Mi'unin, what is mi'unin? There was a halacha that a father could marry off his underage daughter, and she's considered married. So the question comes up: what happens if she has no father, meaning she's a yisoma from a father, but she has a mother? So this is what Rashi says: mi'unin kitana yisoma, a kitana, a young girl who is a yisoma from her father. Shehasua ima v'yachia ledata yotza mimenu b'miu. So in other words, what happens here is that the father dies, the girl is underage, she's 11, whatever, and the mother and or the brothers say, we want to marry her off. We want to make sure that she has a good life. We want to marry her off to this person. So midrabanan, this is a valid marriage. Okay, midrabanan. Now, because only min Torah does the father have the right. When there's no father, there's no min Torah right to do it. But the Rabbanan says that the mother and the brothers can help. Again, this was all done in a positive way to help take care of this young girl so that she shouldn't be, without support.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah.
I see in the notes in the art scroll that when the one for the letter for Chalitza,
Yeah.
drawn up by the Besdin writes that letter.
Right.
So is that different than these other conditions that the individual writes the letter? Wouldn't they have more power or something different because they're the ones who wrote the letter?
No, but all these conditions that we just read are technically court driven. The Igris Shum, that's a court driven letter. The Igris Mazin can be a personal letter, or it can be a court letter that says Reuven has undertaken to sustain the daughter of his new wife. In other words, they can be private, but they're also intended for letters issued by Besdin. Someone goes to Besdin and he says, you know what, I want to memorialize this. Not everybody was a Talmud Chacham. Some of them didn't know the principles of what to do, so they went to Besdin.
If it was written by Besdin, wouldn't the natural answer take it back to Besdin and they'll confirm that they wrote it?
No. The question isn't is the letter valid? The question is, did he give it? Remember, in the past we said if a person wrote a get or wrote a shtar shich and didn't give it, it's not valid. It has to be given.
But there was Adam involved, so isn't there?
No. There's no Adam to the giving. For instance, the Kenyan has Adam. The Kenyan has Adam, but the letter itself doesn't have to have Adam. So what happens if we don't know if a Kenyan was given yet, but we want to know publicly, was this something that he gave or that it was given? So then the court can write a shtar, Iger Shum, this letter of the shibud of property, and the man can say, I'm not issuing it yet. I don't want to issue it yet, for whatever his reason is. So they went to Besdin, they got the letter. Now he, not the Besdin, he has to deliver the letter. Yeah. All of a sudden we find it in the street. Who was it given? Same principles that we had with get and with shtar shikra, but here we're talking about different types of right. So miunin, let's take a look at Rashi miunin. Katana yisoma shesua ima v'yachil ledata yotza memenu b'miyun. She goes out with mian. Mian is technically an annulment of the marriage. Now we're gonna in a minute talk here about annulments versus a divorce, but it's an annulment. The ain't a tzricha get. She does not need a get. She has to come before Mipnei Shlosha, a Besdin of 3, right? I don't want to live with this man, my husband, who was put upon me. The Kosum Besdin Shtar, and the Besdin writes a document Shemi Ona B'fneihem that she kind of came or pleaded before them. Liaslo Eder Shemuteris Linose. So there should be witnesses that she may marry. So here's what happens: the mother or the brothers marry her off. She's not yet about chiyuva. She's not 12, and she says, "I don't want to live with him." Okay, no get necessary, and they issue this called the shtar miyun. Now, in general parlance, we are familiar with annulment. We hear this word annulment. I mean, not so much in Jewish law, but the church has annulled the marriage, or the court, I don't know, has annulled the marriage. So I don't know all the laws with regard to secular annulment, but in halacha, there technically is no annulment. This is an exception where there is no annulment. Where there's no divorce, there's an annulment. So she can be annulled, and now she can marry. So here's the question. It's an interesting question that I thought about, and I started taking a look. What happens if she wants to marry a Kohen? So the pasuk in the Torah, in Vayikra, describes who a Kohen can marry, and who we cannot marry, or basically who we can't marry, to the exclusion of everybody else who we can marry. So the Torah says he can't marry a Gerusha, he can't marry, among other things, a Halala, but he also can't marry a woman who got Chalitza, right? So, but says nothing about a miyum or an annulment. It says nothing about it. So, Minat Torah, I don't know. The only thing that I can extrapolate is something that I saw in the halacha, that a suffix chalitza, in other words, if chalitza should have been issued and wasn't issued, suffix chalitza, since it's midrabanan, since suffix chalitza, in other words, not giving chalitza, a Kohen can marry that woman. So I thought to myself, if in other words, if she doesn't have, remember, we're talking about Kohen Gadol and a regular Kohen. A Kohen can marry an almana, only a Kohen Gadol can. So if she's an almana, and the question is, if you give chalitza, that's kind of the equivalent of maybe a divorce, at least we look at it that way, then a Kohen can't marry her. But if chalitza wasn't given, then since it's midrabanan, he's allowed to marry her. So that's the only loophole that there seems to be, and I haven't exhausted looking at the full halacha yet, but that's the only loophole that possibly may exist where a woman or girl who did not get a get, but she got an annulment, then we say ki'ilu lo hava. It's as if it doesn't happen. If it didn't happen, then technically she can marry a Kohen. It's an interesting question because, again, even today we don't have the Beis Hamikdash. We don't have. There are certain principles that a Kohen takes upon himself, and he shouldn't be metame. They shouldn't marry the people that they're not supposed to marry, depending on who they are. So it does have some practical significance. And the question is, what would happen today if, in fact, there was miyun? And I don't know that can possibly happen. Whether or not an underage girl, obviously there are laws maybe that don't allow for the marriage of an underage girl. So it may be a moot question, but halachically, it's an interesting question to think about. And so, David, were you ever given any practical instruction on miyun when you were a young person and you were looking to marry? Were you counseled on who you shouldn't or shouldn't marry, and did the term miyun come up?
It never comes up on this side of the ocean. But if
Right.
somebody didn't get chalitza, they can't marry anybody. They're tied to the brother.
Tied to the brother. So what's interesting in the responsa, you're technically correct. So it's tied to the brother, but today we don't give chalitza. In other words, whereas it was a practice over many centuries to give chalitza, I think in the state of Israel, by the way, chalitza it's forbidden. There's no chalitza. That much I know. So
chalitza is given. You're talking about
We
Hebrew.
don't do
I'm saying there's no such right. I'm saying chalitza is given. There's no option. There's no option to marry the deceased person's brother. Right. So all kula alma, everybody says chalitza is given. Whereas once upon a time there was a machlokes between Ashkenazim and Sephardim as to whether or not you're supposed to give chalitza. In other words, you can force the person to marry. So these are all somewhat esoteric questions, but since the Mishnah mentions it, obviously in the time of the Mishnah, it was a practical consideration. What happened if this young girl was married and then all of a sudden she annuls her marriage, and whether or not, I mean, look, we have a lot of questions today, and we've had it even close to home, the questions of whether or not Kedushin was chal. In other words, we had questions of whether or not there was even a Kedushin, so that a get, as a practical matter, was given, but maybe not necessary. and it impacts on whether a Kohen can marry a Grusha. I mean, these are practical questions that that the halacha has shilas and chuvas on. Even today, I mean, we know it firsthand. So,
Question. So the way I understand with Yibum and Chalitza is as follows, and I think this would sort of make it all work. The husband dies. There's a brother. There, one of two things should happen: either Yibum or Chalitza. If it's, but there's not an instant marriage, so to speak. It should become a marriage. But think about it. Let's say there were two other brothers. How would you know? You couldn't automatically have a marriage because you don't know which one it's going to be, even though the oldest would, I think, have priority. So therefore, it's not that it's an automatic marriage, and therefore she wouldn't be able to marry anyone. She's not supposed to marry anyone because the brother has the not just right but obligation of first refusal, refusing therefore being chalitza, or if not, then yibum, and that the whole process of chalitza is as if it's married and immediately divorced, or if it's yibum, then it's a marriage, even though it's not quite the normal procedure. And so until in that interim, if just no yibum or chalitza happens, she's not really married, and therefore if it doesn't happen, there might be other issues, but the Kohen wouldn't be prohibited.
right. So this is such a murky area. I even am familiar with that's not a tshuva, but I heard firsthand from a Rav that technically, even bisman hazeh, if a man if it has a brother who died childless, and even if the man, I mean, he was an older person, he wasn't a young man, and the wife could no longer have children, right? So Hakim Shemo Yisrael was not an option. She was an older woman. So what do? I mean, it's a practical matter. He died childless. Let's say she's in her 70s, 60s, whatever the age is, can't have children. What should you do? The brother may or may not be married, but in that particular case, I think he was married. The brother was married, and this Rav said that there's a hava amina that even though we don't have polygamy, he has an obligation to marry her. He should give chalitza. It was, I mean, it was almost beyond what I could really sort of grasp on the halacha. But he said that there is tshuvas that he brought down. He said that under that circumstance, you should just give chalitza to cover all your bases. But when you think about it for a minute, I mean, it's so, remember that there are conditions for yibum. I mean, yeah, they have to have the same father, right? I mean, there's other conditions that don't necessarily play into every circumstance, but yet we're so, I don't know, makbid, or we're so concerned about the right thing to do in those kinds of situations that there's even a havamina to give chalitza, where chalitza would certainly, by every standard, not apply, but just do it to connect the dots to fulfill what might be a halacha. Again, that's really sort of almost beyond what I think would be the normal, but yet, listen, so Chashav who said there is such a havamina, so maybe he should give chalitza, he should really give chalitza under that condition. All I'm trying to point out is that when it comes to the question of isurim, it means marriages and all these other things that have ramifications, we go the extra step, extra mile, even if there is no ramification, because this woman can't have children. There's no question here that if nothing happens, there's no chiyuv hakim shemo b'Yisrael. You can't have hakim shemo b'Yisrael if let's say the woman was barren, and we knew that she could not have children, and she was a young woman. So is there a mitzvah yibum l'hakim shemo b'Yisrael? I mean, these are all questions that up the halacha. And anyway, so that's miyun. So miyun is an interesting category, but I just wanted to mention it in passing because there's not very many gemaras that talk about miyun. So I wanted to mention what it was. Now, the shtori berurin, there's something called shtori berurin, and shtori berurin says Rashi b'Gemara Mefarish. It's a little bit unclear what that is. So Rashi says that let's hold off and we're going to talk about it later. Now, the whole Masa Bezdin. In the previous learning of the last month or more, we've come across this term, and it says when you have Masa Bezdin, Harazeh Yachzir, right? And that so the Mishnah says Harazeh Yachzir, then a Masa Bezdin you can return. And all these categories, meaning Igros Shum, Igros Mazon, all of these things you can return without a problem, including Masa Bezdin. And we've asked, what is Masa Bezdin? And we've referred to it all this time. So let's take a look. Harazeh Yachzir, the Leka Lamecher Shloshema Nimlach, because we're not afraid he will have regret. Remember, the whole issue was what happens if he changes his mind. Previously with the Gittin and Shtar Shiur and Daitike, what happens if he changes his mind? So all those things we say, because of that possibility, we do not give it. Here, the Mishnah is saying in all these cases, give it. Why? Because especially in the case of Masa Bezdin, Bezdin only gives it when it is already a fait accompli, when it's a finished thing. Therefore, there is no concern. So now Rashi goes on and says, what about if it was paid off? In other words, the whole issue we're concerned, if you give it to the creditor, maybe the debtor paid it off, or maybe the ksuba was already paid off. We said in Gerushin. So in other words, what are we about all these things? The Bahana Shtor, Loshayach Buhu Peron, Kedamil El, Va'afila Lamandam Shuma, Hode Ir Afsid and Afshe. So the Gemara, the Rashi is telling us what we have already said in the Gemara, according to one Manda Amr, which we hold to be practical, and that is that you go by what is the normal course of events. In the normal course of events, if someone gets a document to show that it was paid, I mean, then he makes a siman on the document, he rips it up, or does something to show, because otherwise he knows that he's in debt, and he knows that without that document he owes money. So what is a normal person going to do? Today we cancel a check, right? We put void. So, I mean, we go out of our way to ensure that we don't have chiyuvim that we've already taken care of. So the Manda Omani and the Gemara says that a person would be careful, either the afsed and afshay, and if he doesn't do it, he deserves to lose. Afsed and afshay, he's taken the loss upon himself, and he deserves to lose because he didn't do what the rabbis told him to do. When you get a document that you owe money, take care of it, cancel it, rip it up, do what you have to do. So that's pshat in Masa Bezdin. Is a Masa Bezdin is something that is ironclad. And so all these documents that we talk about are Masa Bezdin or are similar to Masa Bezdin. Harazeh Yachzir, you return them. All right, so that's one category of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is now telling us that these documents inherently you can return. Now, the Mishnah now goes on and gives us a second category of documents, which, when I said at the outset, will affect what we learned in the previous Mishnahs about what you can return and not return. And we're going to see what that principle is. Motza b'chafisa or b'deluskama. So chafitza and deluskama, Rashi says shum shtar. So what is chavitza? What are those? So basically, they are they're document holders, if you will, that have a siman. So now this section of the Mishnah is going to talk about regular shtaros, but those shtaros have simanim. And if you can identify the simanim, then the shtar is valid. In other words, if someone had I'll pick a shtar shichra, an emancipation document, which the Mishnah told us we may not return. Why? Because we don't know whether or not the Baal intended to give it or not, right? Or a matana, or even a daitike. So these are questions as to whether or not the intent was still there. This Mishnah is telling us that there is something that supersedes intent, and that is siman. In other words, a star chafisa or deluskama means that it's a regular star, but it's found in an extraordinary place. What's the extraordinary place? It's a leather pouch with the initials of the person who owns it, or with some siman. There's three flowers that were pictured on the clasp of the document holder. I mean, something unusual. So this is very important now, is that with simonim, you can override that which we've learned you shouldn't return. Weiter, another example. Tachrich shel shtoros. If you have a roll of shtoros, meaning documents tend to be, at least we do it now too, but certainly in old times, when they wrote a document, they rolled it up. A Megillah is rolled up. It has some holiness to it, but a Megillah was an igeres, right? It was an igeres. It was a letter, right? So you're supposed to treat it that way, but it was rolled up and then put into a container. So that's the way they used to, when a document was written and signed, a witness was rolled up and either handed over, and what do we do with a ksuba? Okay, a ksuba is unfurled, it's read, and then it's rolled up, and the chassan gives it to the kala. I mean, that's the natural way of doing it. Or aguda shel shtaros, not even a rolled up shtaros, but a pile of shtaros. Let's say a man had to sign a whole bunch of documents, so he was given one after the other, and at the end they were all piled up. You may have had a half a dozen, 10, whatever it is, and they're piled up. Says the Mishnah, Harizeh Yatzir, right? He can return this. Why? Because that's a siman. Says Rashi, oh shemacha tachlif shel shtaros bikrach, which were rolled up in a bundle, or ba'aguda, or in a bundle with the papers were not. But the Gemara mafarish my chafisa b'luskama the tachlif aguda, and the Gemara will go into more detail what all these four, what it means to have a chafisa or deluskama or tachlif or otherwise. Says Rashi, Harizeh Yachzir, the davar sheyesh bo siman, who in a mafarish b'Gemara, because the Gemara explains shahakli siman, that the kli that the document is in that kli is a siman. V'sheyomru habalim b'kli kach v'kach motza osam v'chein tachlech laguda Harizeh Yachzir, the davar sheyesh bo siman, who in a mafarish b'Gemara. So in other words, it isn't just a plain piece of paper that looks like every piece of paper, and you don't know who's right and who's wrong. You're talking about documents that one party can identify and say, oh, of course, those are my documents because I put them into a folder or I rolled them and I put a bow on them, and the bow has this and this, whatever. So now you see that the person who actually owns it can identify it. The other person won't know those identifying marks, and therefore we feel comfortable returning it to the person who gives the siman. So that's now a second category. Okay, first category was the document itself. The second category is a nondescript necessarily document that has simanim. Okay, now Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer. Now Rabbi Shimon Gamliel comes to add something new. What does he say? Echad halova mishlosha. If one person borrows from three lenders, yachzer lelove, you return it to the love. Shlosha halva min ha'echad, three people who borrow from one lender, yachzer lemalve. Okay, what's the theory? Says Rashi, echad halova mishlosha, im shlosha shtarish shalove echad hein shlosha hein shlua mishlushis b'nei adam. So in other words, the likelihood is that you give it to the lover because the lover borrowed from three people. He paid them off. The malver then gave him the document to show proof of payment. Okay, he has not yet destroyed those documents. He tied them together and he loses them. So again, this is Al pi seichel, it wouldn't be the malva because there's three malvas here. What likelihood is that three malvas have shtoris tied together? So Rav Shimon Gamliel is saying this is again a good example of this of what's likely to happen. Now, Yachziram says Rashi, Motzam, if someone finds the Lolove, the Vade Paroim. Certainly he paid them, the Hachziram lo, and it was returned to him, Ubiyodo Naflo, and it fell from his hand. She'im Biyodo Naflo, if it fell from the hand of the Malve, Yikaptzam Lamacham Echad, who collected three diverse loans from three people into one bundle. So the seichel is that it was the love and he dropped it. Says Rav Shimon Gamliel, that's a valid assumption, and we give it. We don't say no, don't give it. We give it to the love. Now, what happens? The converse. If you have you find a bundle and you find it that there were three borrowers and one love and one malve, and the document was lost, showing that. So Rashi says in Shlosha lovim heim shalovim me'odem echod yakziram hamotzam lemalve shahadav yudua shemimenu naflo. Because again, it becomes clear that it can't be the loves. There's three loves here. So it's not the loves. It must have come from the malve, that the malve had not yet collected from any of the loves, and he had the document and he dropped it. He lost it. So therefore, we would return it to the malve. Okay, fine. That's Rav Gamliel's Shimon Gamliel's chiddush. Right now, says the Mishnah, Motor shtar ben shtarosov. What happens if he finds a shtar, and he doesn't know why? You know, he finds a shtar between his other documents. Then Yador Mat Tivo, and he doesn't know what happened. So what does that mean? In other words, there is a shtar. He was given a shtar by two people who were in a transaction, and he was supposed to be the apotropos. He was supposed to be the guardian of the shtar, but he doesn't know. He doesn't remember if the lova gave it to him or the malva gave it to him. Or, in other words, in any scenario, he doesn't remember which of the people gave it to him. So he's in a quandary, and he can't. So what does he do? So the Mishnah says, which is what we say every time that we don't know the right answer. So Rashi says, Eslo imalove if kido etzlo or hamalve or shema miktsasa perua. Maybe it was a partially paid debt. Shlish b'neiam v'shofach. In other words, they partially paid it, and they said, in order for us to be true to each other, let's give it to this individual who's a respected individual, and he'll hold it. And when we finish our transaction, we'll come to him, and he'll give us the shtar. And time passed, and he finds the document in his drawer with many other documents. He doesn't know what to do. Says the Mishnah, so that's one instance where he shouldn't return it to either, because he's not clear. Now, if other people, again, the rules apply with simonim and everything else. So if there were simonim, then fine, he has to give it to the one with simonim. But we're talking about a blank shtar without simonim, and he was given the responsibility of holding it until the completion of an event between two other people, and he doesn't remember. And this one comes in time as, yes, I paid it, you're supposed to give it to me, we forgot to come to you, and vice versa. So he's Solomon-like, and he doesn't know what to do. It says the Mishnah, Yavad Shiavalio. In Yeshimim Symphonos, now here's the final principle, says the Mishnah. If he finds receipts in his desk drawer, and he doesn't, wait a minute, these are receipts that should have been given, and they weren't given. What does he do? Says the Mishnah, and this will be a little bit of an eye-opener, Yase Mashe B'Symphonos. Says Rashi, Yase Mashe B'Symphonos, V'hashtar B'Keskas Perua, V'afapi Shiur, L'Shover Hazer Lios, Munach B'Yahalover, Amin Haminu Halover, V'Omer, Mocha Tanochli V'Shachar. So in other words, he lent somebody money, and l'chayra you should collect, but he doesn't remember. So the Lova says, don't you remember I paid you this money, but on your honor, I couldn't pick it up from you that day. I'll come tomorrow and pick it up. And he says, I truly don't remember. So the obligation is on him that he has to do the right thing and turn over the receipt, since the receipt was written, even though we know from the previous Gemara that receipts are written and not delivered. But in this particular case, if the receipt was in his drawer and the logo says, I paid, then he has to do the right thing. And when he's unclear, he has to give him the receipt as if he paid, which it's kind of unusual given everything we've learned in the Gemara and all the different nuances we have. Yet the Mishnah says that he has to believe the lover that he was going to come back for the receipt, and he has to give it. Yeah, Menashe.
That actually sort of makes sense if I understand all this, which I probably don't. In the case of an ordinary star, you loan the money, here's the star, you pay the money back, you get the star back. There's the question of, was it paid or not, if there's no extra marking on it and so on. But the receipt, if I understand it right, should never have been written until the money was paid. And therefore, if he has a receipt sitting around, not returned, but it's got the guy's, the name, Reuven, receipt Reuven $100 on May 23rd, and it's just sitting there, and you find it a month later, there's no reason why the guy should have. There's always a very tiny possibility. Reuven's about to give Shimon the money, and Reuven writes out the receipt, and then Shimon's writing the receipt, and Reuven says never mind and runs away. But short of something like that,
The
But
overwhelming likelihood is that he was paid and he just
right?
forgot to
That's
give
the point, and therefore, unlike the situation of a star or a ksuba or a get or whatever, where you don't know, did it ever make it from point A to point B or back? Here, it should never have been written unless it was ready to be delivered.
So Menashe, you're 1,000% right. Now let's go back to Yud Ches Amud Aleph. Let's just look at the Mishnah, where the Mishnah says, Vishovrin, that's exactly our case, where you have a receipt and it's sitting there. How is it lo yachzir? Shani Omer exactly what you're pointing out that wouldn't happen happened. He wrote the receipt and he's miyashiv, and he wrote it in advance. He was rushing. He knew he would be paid, so he didn't want to take the time, because remember, receipts were also something written with a sofer, with a scribe. So he went to the scribe. They didn't write it like we do today on an ink pad, where you write it and you have the copy of the receipt underneath. And so he went to the sofer. The sofer prepared the shovrin. He took it home, and then he didn't get paid or whatever. He didn't. And then he had charata.
So then the question then is there a difference? There probably is a difference, because it's a different word. What's the difference between shovrin and, was there some panos here?
Well, some phonos are the equivalent of show. Yeah,
Equivalent, but there must be some difference.
Well, there must be some difference. Okay.
Well,
So-
Rabbi, aren't we just following the principle of Bori and Hashema?
Right, which is yes, to that extent. And take a look at Rashi again. The shover hazer. Look, he's using the word shover in describing some phonos. So as much as it's a nuanced term, Rashi is saying shover, right? He's saying shover. Leos munach biad halover, or mina halover, David, to your point. The lover is believed. V'omer mocha tanoch li. Here's the money. I'm rushing. I trust you. I'll pick it up. V'shochach. Now, this fellow isn't a bad fellow. He just left it in his drawer. The guy never came back. And then a month later, he says, "What happened here?" I mean, he's a business again. He's not. He sits by because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of transactions. He's going to remember the one transaction that happened that he didn't. Again, these are money lenders. Okay, let's look at it in the way it probably was in those times. They were money lenders, and money lenders, whatever, a couple hundred people a day coming back forth this guy's got to be on his toes. So the guy came, he must have been a regular, and he said, okay, here's my money. And the money lender said, thank you, Shimon. And he said, I got to run. I said, don't worry, Shimon, when you come back, I'll give you the receipt. Fine, go. And he didn't come back. And the money lender finds the receipt. Now, you're saying Bari B'Shema. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if that receipt was written out and he can't recall whether or not it was paid or not, then under that circumstance, we say Bari Odif. You're right. So, but it's interesting because in the previous Mishnah, the Mishnah in Yechres didn't go into that question of whether or not, we looked at it only from the perspective of the lender, that the lender had the children and he can I prepare in advance so that I have it, okay? But it was never paid. Otherwise, I would have given it. Yet, so this Mishnah comes and embellishes and gives us a description of what the Mishnah in Yud Ches means, is that if he comes and he says, I paid, he's an Ammon. Right. So on principle, we'll say that we're going to believe the Malveh, right? We're okay. But if the Lover says, but I paid. Now, how often is it that you write the Chauvin and don't use it? So that's the question. So it's almost similar to the situation where the Gemara says, buyer beware, or take it upon yourself. If you made a loan and got the shtar back, don't lose it, rip it up. And we saw the Ramanda Amrim who were machbid on that and said, you know what? You lose. You didn't follow the rules. The rules are that you're supposed to cancel it, tear it, do something to it, because otherwise the whole system of Mekach and Memker, today, of course, you have checks and masses and all these other things, but in a time when it was much simpler and it was all done through documentation, don't lose the document, or for goodness sake, rip it up.
But even today we have that. I mean, the whole concept, and now it's all electronic, but the basic idea, we call it a canceled check.
Correct. But look what Rashi said above when he brought down the Manda Amr, here the Afsid Anafshe. He brought the damage upon himself by not being careful. A, he didn't cancel the check, and B, he lost it. Okay, you shouldn't have lost it. Okay, people lose documents, but at least, what, you want a souvenir? I mean, you paid off your $1,000 loan. Show that he gave you a receipt. Okay, keep the receipt, or take the canceled the note of shibud and rip it up, so he can't come back. There's only one note of shibud. Once that note is destroyed, it's automatically assumed it was paid. So these are all instructions that the Gemara gives us in terms of how Mekach and Memker, how commerce was accomplished in those days. So we have to respect that. So if he doesn't remember and he has a receipt in his drawer, it's incumbent upon him to have given the receipt to the other fellow. So the Gemara says, Mishnah says, if the receipt's in his drawer and the other fellow says, but I did pay you, then he's got to give over the receipt. So that's the clarity that we're, even though it would seem to be questionable in our discussion, but that's how Mekach and Memker commerce is had in a reasonable way, where there won't be all kinds of question marks every day of the year. Did I borrow? Did I lend? Why? People will say, I'm not going to lend to anybody because I'm always in jeopardy. The minute I lend money, I right away am considered to be like, I'm up in the air. Will I ever get my money back? Again, so the Torah never wants to do that. They never want a person to stop lending, but to do the right thing, right? To help his fellow man. So there are certain incumbencies upon him and upon the Loveh as to what to do. So this Mishnah actually gives us some interesting food for thought in terms of what's permissible, what's not permissible, and that which we thought was straightforward, you find out, like for instance with Simonim, the things that we thought you couldn't do with Simonim you could do. So okay, that's the Mishnah. So now we'll have to go into the Gemara a little bit here to have we'll start just to the beginning of the Gemara to have some clarity what we're actually talking about. Okay, says the Gemara. My shtari berurin. Remember, the Rashi said b'shtari berurin. The Gemara, Rashi said the Gemara mufarish. that the Gemara is going to explain what Shtar Berurin is. Okay, so it says the Gemara, Hacha Targumo, meaning in Bavel. Hacha meaning Bavel. That Shtar Berurin means Shtare Tanasa. What is that? Okay, so this is something again, maybe strange to us in terms of our workings, but he says, Rav Yirmiyah Omer Zeh Borolo Echad V'Zeh Borolo Echad. So there's a machlekes of what it is. According to one man Omar, it means tanasa, that when a person says his what there's a machlokes now between two people. Did I pay? Did I not pay? The circumstances of that loan. Let's say someone made a loan, and now they want to understand the circumstances of the loan. So when they come to court, then it's this is the court reporter. This is equivalent to the court reporter today. They sit and they write down the taina. In other words, Reuven comes in with his taina, with his claim. It's written down. Shimon comes in with his counterclaim. It's written down. So those are shtar berurim. Why are they done? It's almost a combination of a reporter and a deposition. Why do we have depositions? Well, commonly depositions are done today for the reason that you want to know in advance, which is permitted, what someone is going to testify if he's called to testify, but it has the secondary purpose of putting down someone's statement or claim and document it, so later on he can't come and say something different. So
Right, the depositions are done under oath. They are done under oath.
Correct. So and they're done under oath with a court reporter or with a reporter present. So the Gemara says this is the predecessor to the deposition. It's tainasa. It's the taina. That is the deposition. In other words, the deposition is you say your view, I say my view. It's documented.
So
we now are before
Berurin is in clarity.
as in clarity. Exactly. Started
It
to
sets the fact pattern of both sides. of
both sides. That's exactly right. Rav Yirmiyah says no, something different. Zeh borolo echad, v'zeh borolo echad. So in order to understand modern day Bezdin, you have to understand that the way Bezdin was conducted, for the most part, not in every case, for the most part, two litigants were litigating over some important matter of commerce, and they came to a disagreement. Now we're going to go to Bezdin. So what is Bezdin? So if you're thinking about it, you say, oh, there's a Bezdin of 3 judges. You come in, you sit before the judges, and you time. The answer is no. That's not typically the way a Bezdin is done. Typically, the way Bezdin is done is one toain, one litigant picks a judge. He picks a judge, goes forum shopping. The other fellow goes and picks a judge, and either the two of them agree on a third or the 2 judges agree on a third. So there's, again, there is some flexibility. The 2 judges can pick a third, or the litigants can say, I want, basically, that judge is going to be his towing. It's going to be his spokesperson, his lawyer. So think about it. You have a Bezdin of 3, and in that Bezdin of 3, you have, now, I pick my lawyer, but that lawyer is objective. He's not subjective. He's not tining for you. Yes, he's presenting your taina, but he hasn't heard the other person's taina yet. It could be when he hears the other person's taina, he'll be swayed to the other person, even though he represents, quote unquote, represents you. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that you're picking the person who's subjectively going to agree with you, because you go to him, he's a Talmud Chacham, you tell him your case, you say, I want you to represent me in Bezdin. He says, sure. The other fellow does the same thing. So these 2 litigants come in with 2 Talmidei Chachamim, both of whom are going to argue their case, because what do? They know the case of the person who they spoke to. They don't know the other guy's case, right? Now, they have to pick a shlish, because remember, a Bezdin of 3 can make a decision 2-1. So the third person didn't hear any of the tinus, not from Reuven, not from Shimon. So he will be, quote unquote, the most objective because he knows nothing. Now, Reuven's Toain, the one who he picked, is now going to listen to the whole case, and Shimon's Toain is going to listen to the whole case. And after they listen to the whole case, they'll either would agree with the person who brought them in, or say, wait a minute, Reuven, I'm hearing something that is very different, and it seems like he's got the day. So it could be there will be a 3-0 decision because both of the two individuals will come to the same conclusion as the third for one side. But if not, no worries, because 2-1 wins. 2-1 wins in Bezdin. So as long as you have a majority, you have a majority. So we're not worried that one person is going to, so to speak, color the decision, because that person may be totally swayed by the person who brought him in, but he doesn't have the final say. The final say is the shlish. So that's what Rabbi Yirmiyah means when he says Zer Boro Lo Echad v'Zer Boro Lo Echad, it's Shtar Berur. So Rashi says, Kishaborin Lahem Dayanim, when they select Dayanim, Kosrin Lahem Zer Boro Lo is Ploni, I pick so and so, Zer Boro Lo is Ploni, and the other one says I pick Ploni, Shelo Yuklu Lachzer Lahem. So, in fact, Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying even more that the fact that he picked this guy, he can't later come back and say, if that borer, if that individual doesn't agree with him, he can't say, oh, I didn't pick him. Where does he come from? In other words, it's a protection in the court that the person who loses, and let's say he loses, and the person who he selected rules against him, he can't say, wait a minute, who, again, it's pretty odd that it would happen, but it's meant to protect the integrity of the system, that everything is documented. So it's clear that Reuven picked this Rav and Shimon picked this Rav, and together they picked a dispassionate third person to make it clear. Again, what we're seeing here is this is what supports the system to make it honorable, so that people will know I can do this, I can lend him money, I can make a business transaction because everybody has my back. This isn't going to be a kangaroo court where I'm going to be railroaded into a decision and I'm going to lose my money. I know in advance that there is such a thing as a Bezdin, there is such a thing as Borer, there is such a thing as each person. So once a person knows the system, there's integrity in the system, and he can say, I can do the right thing because I know that whatever I do, it'll be right, right? So that's the Gemara's way of giving us to understand what a shtar berurin is. And a shtar berurin can apply to any of these cases because in any situation where you have a disagreement between people, shtar berurin applies. And so if there's birur, there's clarity, then there's no ambiguity. And ambiguity is what this mission is about. It's about ambiguity. Did it happen? Did it not happen? Who's right? Who's wrong? So once we have shtar berurin, that's why the Mishnah says Mefarish Gemara, because the Gemara really has to give us an understanding that the bedrock of the system that we use is a system that's foolproof, that will ultimately find the right answer, because we're going to have clarity. No one can say this didn't happen, I didn't do this, I didn't pick this. Everything is documented. Depositions are documented. Judges are documented. So today, by the way, I mean, we have this system, our court system is a pretty well-functioning system because it's under the law. In other words, the law isn't going to be colored to one person. This is the halacha, this is the law, and you go before that. Now, there's always subjectivity in the arguments, but at the end of the day, if we have a judge who is honest and has integrity, then, to the best of his ability, he'll weigh all the arguments. And even in the Bezdin, you're talking about a Bezdin of, let's say, Talmidei Chachamim, where they have to have a certain integrity that they're going to proceed. Okay, so I think we spent a lot of time on this, but this is kind of is critically important for us to understand the rest of the Gemara. So the Gemara is going to pick up next week. It's Hashem, and we're going to start talking about the underpinnings of all of this Mishnah. So to understand what the rights are and how you delineate them. And again, there'll be some repetitiveness to early Gemaras, but since we reference this Mishnah often, the special Masa Bezdin, the term Masa Bezdin came up so often, this is the Mishnah that I pointed to as being the Mishnah that talks about Masa Bezdin. And we know that Masa Bezdin is a blank check. Any Masa Bezdin, Harizeh Yaksir, because we believe in the courts. So now the Mishnah, the Gemara is going to explain to us in more detail what's Pshat Masa Bezdin that we referred to in all the previous discussions. So I hope everything is clear, but we laid the fundamental principles, Mitzvah Shem, of what we're going to pick up to next week.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Irv, is your stuff working now?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Now
hear
we can hear you.
Okay, it's a cousin is Shimon ben Nachum. Your side is Lek Shabbos.
Shimon ben Nachum.
Yeah.
Okay, we did the Refuah Shalema. We did your Refuah Shalema that you always provide. So we took care of that. All right. So
Yeah,
everybody have
thank
a
you.
good week, and we should look
I'm-
back and be zeicha to all of the.
I'm planning to come visit next week.
Oh, wow! You're welcome. Wonderful listening to you. Everything good in Israel from your perspective. Everything is
Absolutely. It's
Baruch Hashem.
great. It's great here.
wonderful. You see that? We have an endorsement that everything we worry about is
No signs of coronavirus anywhere. I mean, there's some rules,
coronavirus.
but very few.
and signs of quiet on the front. So Baruch Hashem, we're Eretz Yisrael is Rabbi Shalom watches over Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah.
Yeshikayach Mitzvah next
Also,
week.
Irv, next Shabbos, the shul is wide open. So,
Oh, really?
yeah, so I'm not sure there'll be minyanim in Rabbi Pepper's house yet, so you might,
I think he said he's going to continue for another week, a couple
Okay.
of weeks.
okay,
All right.
we'll see. All right.
All right.
Okay,
Yeshikayach,
thank you.
Thank you. Everybody keep safe.
Thank you.
Everybody
Rabbi.
keep safe and safe. Yeshikayach to everybody.
Go on.